Okay, welcome for those of you guys who are joining live. I expect a lot of people are probably going to have to catch up on the recording of our interview today with Lucy S.R. Austen, author of Elisabeth Elliot, A Life. But I'm Jen, and I figure that you probably know that if you made your way here. I'm really excited to talk about Lucy about her book, about the writing of the book, about the complications, contradictions, ironies, many wonderful things about Elisabeth Elliot's life. And I would just say that I am a person who deeply admired Elisabeth Elliot. I think probably beginning with my time at Wheaton College, and I lived in the dorm that Elisabeth Elliot lived in my junior year. And I did sort of have these imaginations that I was in her room and I was, maybe channeling like her deep devotion to Jesus and who knows where God would send me. But and then, I definitely read a lot of her books, and I was explaining to both Lucy and Abby Murish, who is also joining us on this call. Abby, do you want to say hello?
Hello, I'm happy to be here. I was wondering.
Hello. Abby is the co-collaborator, co-laborer, co-conspirator at a habit called Faith, and she is the women's ministry director of my church, and so she's definitely going to be participating in this conversation until she has to go pick up her preschool age children early since the sitter fell through. But enough about me. We're going to get into this conversation. I'm really excited to introduce to you Lucy S.R. Austen. And Lucy, I would love for you to just, begin to tell us a little bit about yourself, about where you live, about your writing formation. Just give our listeners a little bit of biography.
Okay. Hello, everybody, and thanks for being here. It's good to see you all. I live in Western Washington State, and I have a BA in English from the University of Washington. And I've been really lucky. I've always gotten to work part-time in my field since graduation. So I've done a lot of different things. I've done some high school English correspondence teaching and tutoring and copy editing and proofreading, and worked as an editor for a small literary journal, and written some articles and written some high school English textbooks, and now this biography of Elisabeth Elliot. So yeah, and I have my formation as a writer. I think I've just always loved to read. I don't remember wanting to be a writer when I was younger necessarily. I'm just loving books. And um, I grew up in just outside a small town in the foothills of the Cascades, and was always either outside running around in the woods or inside curled up with a book. So that was kind of my childhood. And I read, my parents' house was full of books and magazines, and I read everything from, books for kids that were much younger than me to books that were meant for adults that I didn't always understand, but I was just a voracious reader. So by the time I got to college, I wanted to be able to do the things with words that I saw in the books that I was reading. Words were just kind of part of me. So I pursued expository writing in college, and yeah, I've just never stopped writing since then. So I do a lot of my writing now, just kind of in dribs and drabs. First thing in the morning, last thing at night during naps, while my kids are playing, or if a family member is watching them. So that is my writing life, happens in the nooks and crannies now. But yeah.
Which is an incredible inspiration, I think, to a lot of writers, because I think we can tend to idealize the writing life and imagine that the people who are getting the work done, have these large swaths of time and the privilege of uninterrupted, quiet. And it sounds like you are kind of making it work.
Yeah, during the time that I was under contract for this book manuscript, I did have kind of a 40-hour writing week for about I want to say a couple of years, a year and a half. from the time that I signed the contract until the pandemic started. My dad came and taught our homeschool and hung out with my kids. But other than that, yeah, it's been very catch as catch can. I sit in the bathroom while they splash in the tub and type in the corner. So
And try to make sure the water doesn't get on the keyboard.
exactly.
Well, so I do want you to tell the story of how you came to this book, how you, I mean, it's quite a Herculean task, if I can say, for sort of your first, Christian book. I mean, you've obviously published other writing, but this is your first book, right? Or you said textbooks.
Yeah, so I've done a couple of high school English textbooks, but this is the first book like this that I have done. Yeah. So
tell us how you got introduced to Elisabeth Elliot, how you got to this kind of idea in your head, like, I'm gonna write her biography, and then how do you get it contracted, and just give us a sense of the story of writing the book.
yeah, so I had read a little bit by her when I was in high school, books that my mom had, and particularly No Graven Image, which is her novel, which really stood out to me at the time. It was very different from any other Christian, explicitly Christian fiction that I had read at that point. And so then, several years later, when I was working on these high school English textbooks that focused on the work of Christian writers, I knew I wanted to include her novel in the readings for the students. And so I needed to write a little mini biography of each of the authors that were included in that book. So I would check out several biographies from the library, read them and make notes, and then write my sketch from that. And I was just very startled, almost shocked to find that there wasn't a full-length biography of Elisabeth Elliot in existence at that time. I couldn't believe that somebody as prolific as she was as a writer and as influential as a speaker had not already had a biography written of her. So I had to kind of go dig around in her writing and some other articles that I could find and so on for some autobiographical information to write that brief biography. And I was really, the more I learned about her, the more intrigued I was by her life. And so after that project was finished and kind of put to bed, I kept kind of thinking about her and mulling over her life. And eventually I woke up in the middle of the night and my brain was very busily out, like making an outline for a book about her life. And I thought, well, I had thought, well, maybe when my kids are grown, I'll have time to work on a project like that. I thought, well, maybe I'll just start working on it a little bit at a time and see what happens. So, and here we are, a little over a decade later.
Well, say a little bit more about the intriguing aspects of her life that initially kindled your curiosity about her life.
Oh, okay. Well, I think kind of one example is that I read actually in a biography of Rachel Saint from the early 80s, some information about Elisabeth Elliot's positions on particularly on how missionaries ought to approach polygamy in tribes that they were interacting with. And she was arguing that that polygamy basically was the support for widows and orphans that was structured into groups like this, and that you shouldn't just march in and put a ban on it without having some kind of alternative support system established first. And having read Passion and Purity, and coming from an American perspective, that was a very unexpected position for her to take to me. And so things like that, where the more I found out about her, there were things that challenged my preconceptions about how she would think or how she would act, really piqued my interest, and I wanted to know more. So.
Mm-hmm. Well, when you were, I mean, so many things we have to talk about today. But back to the process of writing. So, you're initially intrigued by her life, and curious about her thinking, and you wake up in the middle of the night and think, maybe this is my project. So then you start to research. And what does the research process look like? But I'm also very just curious as a writer about the nuts and bolts of like getting the research down and collected and then easily accessible for when you actually need to write the project. So tell us a little bit about that.
Yeah, I started with just pure research. I did about 3 years of just working on research before I started writing. And I started by trying to find people who knew her and conducting interviews, knowing, that she was, that her generation was rapidly aging, and kind of feeling like I was up against the clock to talk to people. So I did that, and I had various like graduate students from Wheaton and so on who helped me transcribe those so that they were searchable easily by computer when I wanted to look back at them later. Yeah, and then after she went to be with the Lord in 2015, I started writing, and I also went to the excuse me, to the Wheaton Billy Graham Center archives, where a huge number of her papers are kept, and started doing work in her papers at that point. So yeah, so then the next I think 4 years, I was writing and continuing to kind of do research to fill in the gaps as I went. And then yeah, it was like from the time the manuscript was finished, it was a 2-year process to get the book through to publication and into readers' hands. So.
And at what point is the book actually contracted in this whole process?
I think it was 2018.
Okay.
Yeah.
And so do you have a full manuscript at that point?
No. So my proposal I submitted with 2 complete chapters and most of a third one.
Okay.
So, and then completed the manuscript after under the gun.
Yeah. Which generally tends to be a very good source of motivation. Yeah. And when do you realize that there's an authorized biography? And I do want you to speak to just the difference between an authorized biography. So I'm speaking of Ellen Vaughn's 2-volume biography. Let me make sure that everybody's muted. Just make sure you're muted in case you aren't. But so Ellen Vaughn's biography, 2-volume biography, how that's, quote unquote authorized, you can see the big sticker on it. So when do you realize that there's an authorized biography? And then talk us through what is the difference between an authorized biography and an unauthorized. I don't know that I want to call your biography unauthorized, but yeah.
Yeah. So the kind of classic 2 potential differences between an authorized biography and an unauthorized biography are there's potential for an authorized biography to have access to sources that the unauthorized biographer might not have access to. And then there's kind of the understanding that they are publishing whatever they're sharing with the authorization of whoever has authorized the biography, whether that's the subject, the family of the subject, the estate of the subject, whoever has done the authorizing. So I'm trying to remember, I learned that there was an authorized biography in the works, I think around the time I was submitting I did quite a few submissions, but around the time that I was submitting the proposal that was actually accepted. So So that was information that I included in the proposal. You know, this other book is in the works, but you know, I think there's enough. Elisabeth Elliot is an influential enough figure that there's room for a lot of writing about her. There's room for more than 2 biographies, you know, as more material comes to light and as more work is done on her life. So, so I felt like, you know, it was still a valid and important project, and the publisher agreed with me. So, so here we are. So,
And I think readers too.
yeah. So, and I think now that the second volume of Ellen Vaughn's biography has come out, I haven't actually had a chance to read the whole thing yet. I've skimmed, I've gone through it 90 miles an hour and kind of checked parts to see, you know, what's there. But I mean, I think to everybody's credit who was involved, you know, it doesn't appear that there's any kind of trying to filter things or hide things, or I mean, I think it looks like a good it looks like we saw a lot of the same fact patterns in the material, and they were reported in both biographies. So
I'm curious if you know, I mean, there's so much to talk about on that, and we're not really going to go down that rabbit hole. But I do think it was certainly a question that was of interest for me, and I hadn't really seen much published about, you know, just the provenance of the 2 biographies really literally coming out at the same time. But also, I'm just curious. Well, tell us about your source material, and as opposed to, you know, and what you might not have had access to. And then if you've, in reading, I mean, you said you haven't really read the second volume of Vaughn's, but is there anything that has come to light for you that you might write differently now?
well, my source material is so all of her papers that are publicly available at the Billy Graham Center archives, and I conducted over 24 interviews in the course of my research, and that's with family and friends and co-workers and caregivers and people kind of who knew her throughout her life. So, and then among her papers at the archives are photographs of sections of her journals from several different portions of her life, starting in childhood and going up through her marriage to Addison Leach. So, so I had access to all of that. The complete, apparently the surviving journals, Ellen Vaughn had access to, and I have not. I haven't seen them. So, so she had definitely had more journal access than I did. And remind me again, what was the other? Those were my main sources.
I asked you like 8 questions in one, all wrapped up into one. So I don't even know if I can remember.
So those were my sources. Yeah.
I think the one thing I had asked was just of what you've read so far, is there anything from the private journals that have now been published in Vaughn's work? Anything that sort of illuminates further, elucidates something that previously had been perplexing or bewildering or yeah.
Everything that I've seen looks like it just supports you know, if there's additional detail there, it just supports the picture that I found in the material that was accessible to me. So
Well, thank you. Thanks for just sharing a little bit about just the process of writing a biography, which I just stand in awe of, truthfully, because it is such a huge task. You know, let's talk a little bit about just historical context,
Mhm.
because as you're writing about a figure, of course, like they're situated in time. And I thought it was really wonderful how much historical context you were bringing out in the book. So can you speak to some of those sources that you were using, some of the context that felt really important to situate Elisabeth Elliot in her century?
Yeah, it's funny because it's like every author wants everybody to read their book. I think I wanted all the historical detail. So you can all thank the editor for reining me in. Um, but yeah, I mean, Elisabeth Elliot was alive until 2015. And so, I mean, that's not that long ago. That's less than a decade still. Um, so I think it can be easy to kind of fall into thinking, she's still our contemporary. We know the context of her life. But one thing that really kind of stood out to me as I was researching and writing was that, when she was born the year of Charles Lindbergh's flight. And so when her parents made their missionary journeys, it was by steamship. And when she went away to college, she was taking her clothes in steamer trunks, not in suitcases and backpacks and duffel bags, or a laundry basket or a cardboard box or whatever. And when she first went to the mission field in her 20s, it was on a boat, not a plane. So, and that transition to flying back and forth from the mission field came during her lifetime. So that's just one example of how um, the past really is a foreign country, and we really do more than we think we need to try to kind of get back there and understand that it was different and the world looked different. So so there were two main kinds of context that I tried to understand myself so that it could shape the writing and then also share with readers. And the first one is just that general social historical context. Um, I researched what did it mean to be a teenager when she was a teenager, and when did they invent air conditioning, and what were the medical treatments available for tuberculosis, and when did they invent the TV dinner? Tons of details like that. Where did people go on vacation and how much did it cost? Lots of things like that. And then along with that, the sort of the theological and philosophical underpinnings of the world that she lived in. So, when her parents were teaching her about God, or the sermons that she was sitting under every Sunday as she grew up, the college professors at her Christian college, all those things. What were the kind of assumptions about the world that they were operating under that kind of formed the air she was breathing? Because we don't necessarily know when we're 10 and we're listening to the pastor on Sunday that he's amillennial or premillennial or whatever labels we give to our systematic theologies. But those things still kind of, without even realizing it, make the foundation for how we view the world. So those were kind of the things that I tried to figure out and understand. And so, I relied a lot on other historians who have done work in all those fields. And I also, tried to read as many source documents as I could. So, for example, with the tension between kind of liberalism and conservatism in evangelicalism, I read the controversial speech by Charles Briggs that kind of kicked off public awareness of that tension. And the notes from the record from his heresy trial that followed that, and then the books that were spawned by that to try to get an idea of what that argument was really like then. So that's just one example. But
And you see how this just sort of proliferates.
Yes.
right? Like one question just spawns 1,800 more questions. So I
Yeah.
am very curious. I mean, to think about, how did you know when to stop? How did you how were you able to say, like, this is sufficient? I could endlessly, follow all of these trails.
Yeah. I think um, writing it down helped figure out when to stop. And
Mm,
a lot of what I ended up writing didn't make it into the final manuscript, but it got the ideas into a coherent form in my mind,
mm.
which helped me know that I had enough information about that to be able to say what I wanted to say. So,
Mhm. Well, since we're talking about situating Elisabeth Elliot historically, I just want to ask Abby if she wants to ask her question, because I think it's probably a very pressing, urgent question for a lot of women who are thinking about some of the things that she wrote about womanhood. So Abby, I'm going to turn it over to you.
Sure. This was something that struck me when I was reading Elisabeth Elliot in college, and then it kind of resurfaced reading your biography, but how much she is remembered or seen as an example to women because of her belief about gender and the importance placed on homemaking as a
mhm,
vocation. And yet I'm struck that she also had this immensely full career as both
mhm,
a missionary, a Bible translator that used so many of those skills. And then post the mission field, she was writing and speaking frequently.
mhm.
And did you find, as you were writing this, any contradiction there? Was there a contradiction that she acknowledged? And then I'm just struck, and I'm going to be thinking about this for a while, how we see those two things in our contemporary evangelicalism, and how she
Mhm.
was kind of a prototype for that, that women who are who exalt homemaking, and that's us, but they also have these careers as writers, writing
Mhm.
about homemaking and gender roles.
Yeah. Yeah. It's a great question. It's complicated to figure out how to answer briefly.
Mm,
Um, yes, I think there was a contradiction. No, it does not look to me like she was aware of it, aware of the contradiction that I see. Um, I suspect that she was not aware of the contradiction because for a couple of reasons. The first reason being that um, she started her linguistic work when she was unmarried and did not expect to be married necessarily. Um, she gave it a put it, I mean, she still was working on it, but it took a back seat to homemaking and raising her daughter um, during the time that she was married, and then to Jim. And then after he died, um, she did not have a breadwinner and a provider to fill that role in her family. She felt that loss deeply. She felt like she was um, being denied her role as a woman by having to step back into that primary role in her family at that time. Um, so she continued her mission work. Then she launched a career as a writer. And again, I mean, she had to eat and she had to feed her daughter, and this was the skill set that she had available to her. And so again, I don't think she saw it as a contradiction because it wasn't her choice to be the primary breadwinner for her family. Um, and then when she married again, her daughter was in high school, and and you know, feeding herself and dressing herself and being an older child. Um, and again, her own writing took last place behind her husband's job, behind her homemaking in her day, and really she wrote and published very little during her second marriage, and
mm,
then her husband died again. And so she was back to being her own sole supporter. Her daughter was grown and out of the house, and so I think that is why it didn't look like a contradiction to her. And as far as not seeing a contradiction in what she was telling, how she was teaching other people, she thought of herself as speaking, I think, and I'm basing this on her writing, as speaking to the majority of women who she thought would be married. And I think the book discusses this statistically. At the time that she was saying that she was thinking of the majority of women as being married. Yes, the majority of women were being married, but the percentage that would never be married or were unmarried, for major portions of their life was still millions of people. So it's it kind of depends on how you're thinking about it. Well, yes, you're speaking to the majority, but the minority is a substantial population. So, I'm probably missing part of the question you asked me at this point, but I think that's why it doesn't look like a contradiction to her. But yeah, I mean, there are multiple speeches and things that she wrote where she's encouraging men and women to go out to the mission field in obedience to God, and saying that you don't need what she called at that time, what they were calling at that time, the women's liberation movement to do that. And I think maybe not fully understanding the freedoms and education that the earlier women's liberation movement had allowed her to have that let her do the missionary work that she did. So yeah, I do see a contradiction there.
It's very interesting, just because for another project I was reading Betty Friedan's Feminine Mystique and realizing like they're complete contemporaries.
Yes.
Friedan is just 2 years younger, I think, or older than Elliot. Graduated from Smith, I think, in 42, and was Elliot 46, or I don't know. I mean, but
Elliot graduated in 48, so
48.
just a few years apart. Yeah.
Okay. So it's just really interesting. I mean, how much do you situate her thinking about womanhood as sort of historically, culturally conditioned? Like this is emerging out of a particular moment.
Very strongly, yes.
Okay.
Yeah. Both out of the feminine mystique moment, and then earlier out of the widespread cultural teaching about the sexes that was just commonplace in America when she was a child and a teenager. And again, I think the biography mentions this, but there are places where the advice she gives on the roles of the sexes, for example, in Passion and Purity, is almost word for word the same as general market dating advice books from the 1950s. And 40s. So, books that she could potentially have read as a teenager, as an adolescent. There's no record that she read them, but that was the advice that was in the air. And it was, it's in the advertisements, in the magazines. It's everywhere around you, your culture's attitude toward men and women. So.
And then what is the position that you take as a biographer? Like what's the interpretive position that you take, or did you take, or did you feel like you were more withholding judgment? And then what do you think about readers who really want to judge Elisabeth Elliot? I mean, either they want to exonerate her, or they want to indict her, or maybe the position is deep sympathy. So what position do you kind of take interpretively about, here's a woman who had very strong teachings about, the very strict gender roles and responsibilities that both men and women had. And now we're sort of saying, well, that actually emerged out of a historical moment. What position do you take on that?
Interpretively, in writing the book, my position was, as much as possible, to report the facts. It's not the biography's job to to take positions and argue for and against them. Where I did sort of interject an authorial voice, my goal or my hope was just to sort of gently highlight an area that the reader might gloss over from familiarity. But the biography itself my goal was to present as many of the facts as clearly as possible. Because if we're going to have a conversation about her life and her teaching, and do the kind of evaluative work that you're talking about, we need to know the foundation for that, if it's going to be productive at all, is what that work taught, what that life was, the facts. So, and then, with those facts, readers can make their own evaluations and judgments. And I've heard, I've gotten feedback from readers who have made a wide range of different evaluations, and not all of them are the evaluations that I would personally make given that information, which I hope means that I did a good job of presenting the facts and letting the reader evaluate them for themselves. So as far as I think you said exonerating or indicting her, I think I do think that that's a tempting framework, because it's very uncomfortable to kind of sit in the tension of, well, yes, there were very harmful things, but there were also very wonderful things. That's uncomfortable. I think human nature wants there to be the fairy tale with the witch who is all bad and the prince who is all good. And and I don't think that that's the reality that we live in. So as far as exonerating or indicting her, it seems to me that that from a Christian perspective, we're not allowed to do either one necessarily completely of her as a person. I mean, when you say you want to exonerate her for any harm coming from her actions or her teachings, I mean, that's not, we can't undo the harm. The harm isn't undone by the good things that she did and taught. On the other hand, the good isn't undone by the harm. And that sort of, that gets down, I think, to really fundamental questions about the judgment of God, the mercy of God, and how God is going to sort out this mess at the end of time. So I think that that's, for me, there's just a tension there, and it's not resolvable. The resolution of that tension, it involves how God is going to manage a just and merciful judgment of the world. And what it means for justice and mercy to coexist. So as far as her teaching, I don't think that holding her as a person with that sort of thoughtfulness that we would want applied to our own lives means that we can't evaluate her teaching and accept parts of it and reject parts of it. So certainly I think there's no obligation to wholesale accept or reject any of what she wrote and taught. Excuse me.
I think that's really beautifully said. And I wonder if that isn't just one of the graces that we experience as we read biography, that we just see that human lives don't break down into good and bad and nice and mean. And
yeah.
And also, I think like naive and, you know, whatever the opposite of that would be, because I think it's easy, perhaps, you know, there are women who come to the story of Elisabeth Elliot, or maybe the teachings of Elisabeth Elliot, and ascribe to her a kind of naivete, you know, that this was a woman who just clearly didn't think. She just sort of assimilated the cultural assumptions of her day. And you're admitting she was, you know, very much, you know, there were cultural assumptions that she did not test. But tell us more about Elisabeth Elliot, the thinker, the writer, the biblical exegete, that would at least allow us to understand her real wrestlings and grapplings.
Wow, yeah. I feel like this is like you need to go read the book
Yes, you
there's
do.
a lot and it's hard to think how to boil it down. I mean, she was a from an early age a very thoughtful and devout believer in Jesus, and it was very important to her not just to believe a set of propositions, but to live a life that was transformed inside and out, in imitation of Jesus. So she read the Bible widely and deeply. I mean, she started at the beginning and went to the end over and over and over again throughout her life. She obviously studied, you know, deeply as a Bible translator, trying to figure out how to best communicate the passages that she was translating. And she went over and over her translations and changed them, trying to get them right. And, you know, particularly when she was living with the Wairani, there just was not a lot to do besides think. So she was a deep thinker. She spent a lot of time thinking. She wrestled with her ideas in her journals, in her letters to her family. You know, and she thought a lot, particularly, you know, during the later portion of her time in Ecuador and the first few years after she got home, about how the teaching that she had received lined up with the life that she had experienced, and how they could be reconciled, and where her understanding of the teaching needed to change. So I mean, she was a very thoughtful person.
Outside?
I also think that her, you know, her understanding of what it meant to be in relationship with her husbands affected how she approached her positions on ideas during the times that she was married. So, you know, that affected, I mean, I think she felt like she was in a position to be learning from and guided by her husbands during the times that she was married. And so that also affected her thinking. If there was more to your question that I haven't answered, please ask me again.
Well, I think, I mean, you had mentioned in your notes about how she did change her mind about things.
Yes.
You know? So she wasn't, and even No Graven Image. I actually don't know that many people have really even read that. I certainly have never read that novel, but that was a very thoughtful critique of the kind of missions moment. Maybe you could just say a little bit about that, how, I mean, because I don't think that people sort of expect Elisabeth Elliot, especially in her earlier years. I think this was more true in her earlier years. I'd be interested if you would agree with that, that earlier she was kind of more confrontational, or maybe more willing to write things that didn't, I don't know, you know, didn't jive with the general sort of ethos of American evangelicalism. So talk about No Graven Image, talk about like her willingness to change her mind, but then we're going to have to go back to the marriage comment, because yeah, we're definitely going back there.
Well, so No Graven Image is a a book where, I mean, you can just see the fingerprints of her own experience on the mission field all over it, but it's a single young woman who's a missionary in the mountains in Ecuador with a Quechua speaking people group. And just the experiences that she has that challenge everything she has believed about the mission field before she has moved to Ecuador. And and I won't give spoilers because I'm a big apologist for the book, and I think everybody needs to go get a copy and read it. But she, by the end of the book, you know, she is still a person of faith in God, but many of the prior assumptions that she had have kind of fallen along the way, and she's working on figuring out a new set of beliefs, I guess, in some ways. So so yeah, I mean, I think that book, which she wrote, that was the first book she wrote after moving back to the US, is in many ways kind of her best attempt at conveying her missionary experience. So it, you know, it's a good book on its own. It's very well written. It's very thought-provoking, but also if you're interested in Elisabeth Elliot's life, I mean, that's her best effort at kind of encapsulating how she was thinking about her time on the mission field at that point in her life. So yeah, everybody should read that. And as far as thinking about, you know, whether she was more open at different times in her life, I mean, I think I would not say earlier versus later. I think that I would say that when she felt like she was solely responsible for her positions, she wrestled with them very deeply, and she was made maybe some more changes in her thinking during those times. And not that she didn't still wrestle deeply at other times in her life, and not that she wasn't sincere and devout at every time in her life, because I think that she was. But again, I think that her understanding of her relationship to her husbands changed a little bit of, I mean, she felt that the buck didn't stop with her at that point, and that just changed her approach to things. So
perfect segue, because we're going to talk about her second. I'd like to talk about her second marriage, because I think we often think about Jim and Elisabeth Elliot. Obviously, there's been a lot written about them and about their story, and that's sort of why they're lionized in American evangelical history. And so I think Jim and Elisabeth, that marriage is more familiar to us. But talk to us about her second marriage to Addison Leach. Her, are you heading out, Abby?
I just want to say I'm sad to be leaving now, but
You have to catch up on the rest of the recording.
I will. Thank you so much, Lucy.
good to see you. Take care.
Yeah, Abby. Abby had a childcare arrangements fell through. But yeah, so her second marriage to Addison, and I'd love for you to just sketch it for us, who he was, what their marriage was like, and then in specific, talk about this dynamic of being married and sort of maybe not being as free to express her opinions. And then talk about her third marriage to Lars Glenn. It's Glenn, right? Gren. You know, the term, you know, just sort of the context for that marriage, and then in particular this dynamic in that third marriage. So start with Addison.
Okay. So Addison Leach was an academic, and they met when she was speaking at the school where he taught. And after the death of his first wife, they were engaged and married in pretty short order. And I think he was 60 and she was 42, I think, when they got married. And they they moved to Massachusetts, where she would live for the rest of her life, when he took a job at a school there. So yeah, so he was a professor and involved with the school, and she was the professor's wife and did a lot of social hosting. A lot of social hosting.
I was so tired to read
I
about
know,
those years.
yes. Yeah. She did also have an office that was offered to her at the college, where she wrote, she would drive him to work 3 days a week and work there, and then on writing. So she did continue writing. I think the majority of her time at that point was going to homemaking, but she was still writing. So, but she felt like he had a much deeper educational background than she did, and she felt like she had a lot to learn from him. And as the book describes, in pretty short order, after they were married, the opinions that she was expressing in her writing really changed quite a lot. And they were pretty different from the opinions that she had been expressing not all that long before. And they sounded a lot more like the opinions that Addison Leach expressed in his published writing. So I think, by comparing what she wrote before, what she wrote during their marriage, what he was writing around that time, you can make a pretty strong correlation, at least, between her changing views and his positions on things. So
Was there a particular thing that just stands out to you in terms of maybe an issue that she took a different side on, or just something that evolved during that time? Or was it in particular gender roles?
The first thing that comes to mind when you say that is she had talked a lot about honesty and truth telling ever since she had come back from Ecuador. And he, wrote about kind of the current cultural moment of the 60s, and the new emphasis on freedom of expression and speaking your mind and so on, as being kind of dishonest and an excuse for breaking the rules and sloppy thinking. And then she started talking about this youth cult of honesty, which is really so phony and disingenuous. So that's just one
Oh,
example
that's very interesting.
that
That's a
comes
great
to mind.
example.
Yeah.
Okay.
So,
And he was regularly writing a column for Christianity Today. And I
yes.
think actually, I'm just remembering that he was continuing that even during his terrible, anguishing cancer journey,
Yes.
right?
Yeah, I was
Um,
amazed at how long into his cancer journey he kept working.
yeah.
Yeah.
Okay, so let's talk about what I think a lot of people probably are also probably maybe the most shocking revelation of the book, or just of her story. I don't know that we really understood much about her third marriage, so talk
Mhm.
about that.
Yeah. Yeah. I think she was very private about all of her, her marriages. But she was not a public figure during her marriage to Jim. And I think she probably felt more free to talk about their relationship in her writing and so on later on, because he was gone. So um so yeah, she was very private about their marriage. And so I do think that it was a startling revelation, that it was so difficult. So um yeah, it kind of, from the very beginning, there were good things, and they had good times together, but there were also, just from the very beginning, very difficult aspects of that marriage that lasted for as long as the marriage. So
And she, 9 days after the wedding, said she'd made a mistake. She told somebody that. Do I remember reading that?
yeah, I think it was sooner than that.
Okay.
Yeah.
How do you characterize that third marriage? Would you say abusive is too strong of language?
Um, I mean, the book lays out the facts as they are available at this time. And readers can judge, for themselves. My own personal opinion, I would have characterized the relationship as abusive, emotionally abusive, if that was happening to one of my kids.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Which is just so grief, it just fills my heart with such grief.
Yes.
Because her theology, or let me ask you this, do you believe that her theology sort of led to the marriage and then kept her in the marriage? Or do you think that, but yeah, I mean, I'm asking you to be very interpretive. I'll just say that I find that she has some ideas about obedience that feel very contorted to me. Almost this idea of like, you just choose the hard thing, or if your
And
heart says that you want to do it, you probably shouldn't, or vice
if I
versa.
can just interject, in one of her
Please.
books, she explicitly says that
Does
if
she?
you've got two paths that are equally morally acceptable and you're trying to decide between them and you don't have any other way to choose between them, you should choose the harder one.
And that, I mean, honestly, my first book, I feel like, was my sort of pushback against that. Like, where does this come from? And I certainly don't want to, I don't think it's too easy to draw this kind of idealist sort of narrative of like, I read this book and therefore my life turned out in this way. I think that books are often representing a conversation that's happening in a certain time period.
Yes.
And certainly to be formed in the missions movement, in the 40s and 50s was, you're carrying your cross, you are taking up the difficult task of obedience to carry the gospel throughout the world. So I'm sure that informed it. But so then to the question, is it some of these contorted ideas about obedience that lead her to marry Lars, or do you think it's just a general desire for security? Maybe both and more.
I think that's a really difficult question to try to parse out because so life is so complicated and the ways we make decisions are so complicated. I mean, I do think she did love Lars, and so I mean, that's a factor.
Yeah.
I mean, he was not, just like she wasn't the black hat villain of a cowboy movie. He wasn't the black hat villain of a cowboy. He isn't the black hat villain of a cowboy movie. And so, I mean, he's a person made in the image of God with a lot of gifts and strengths and good things about him, which she appreciated. And so, I mean, I think that was certainly a large factor in her decision to get married again. I think, she has said in interviews that she felt like in her reading of scripture, she was being encouraged to consider his proposals. And obviously her theology plays a role in that. And her understanding of what the roles of men and women are and how they ought to behave plays a role in that. So yeah, I mean, I think there were multiple factors. But yeah, and also, I mean, the book discusses that she was lonely. I mean, people get lonely. So
Right.
she was lonely and she
Absolutely.
was tired, and so yeah.
Yeah.
So lots of factors.
I do wish she'd had more professional help. I think that would have alleviated a lot of burdens for her, as she's just organizing a very complicated speaking schedule and getting books and to places, and and that's a role that he filled for her. But I kind of wish she maybe just had more help in that area. I think it was also really lovely, just to your point, that he's not the black hat villain. Maybe you can just speak to the care that he gave her to her in her final years. And was it her brother who spoke very with a lot of commendation about his care?
Yeah. Yeah. And her brother Tom emphasized that, once she was well into dementia and he was providing all the caregiving for her, that he did a very good job. And I mean, she was able to stay in her own home until she died. And they had, you know, certified nursing assistants living in the home to be available to take care of her around the clock. And I was able to visit with them in November of 2014 before she died in June of 2015.
Oh, wow.
And her hair was always freshly permed and neatly combed, and she was nicely dressed. And she was, I can't imagine a better, set of circumstances to live out the last days of dementia in. So.
Well, we're already backed up against our timeline. It's been an hour, and I know you have children that you must attend to. Just a final, I mean, I want to just have the book here and just say, absolutely, everybody should read this. You need to read it. I think Elisabeth Elliot is this very complicated, admirable, sympathetic, difficult, there are just so many things. It's a human story. And I think we can find our own humanness very much in the midst of the pages. But just a final word of what do you hope readers are going to take away from Elisabeth Elliot, A Life?
I think that complexity that you have just kind of referenced would be one thing, and that because she was so committed to following Jesus and understanding what he wanted for her all through her life. I think there can be a temptation to sort of pick your set of beliefs, pick your role in life, and then go with that. And she was always reevaluating where the Lord wanted her and what the Lord wanted for her. And so she was always committed to studying and learning and changing and growth. And because of that, she held different positions at different points in time. And so just by default, sometimes she was wrong, because you can't change your mind about things
Right.
without sometimes being wrong. You were wrong before, or you're wrong after, one way or the other. So, but she trusted that God was big enough to hold that and to hold her. And I hope that learning more about her life and thinking more about her life will encourage readers to trust that God is big enough to hold us, and the messiness and the heartache and the ups and downs and the mistakes and the not understanding and the changing our minds, all those things that are kind of unavoidable in human life, that God is big enough to hold us, and his promises of redemption still stand. So she always closed her radio broadcast or opened her radio broadcast, I guess, by saying, "You are loved with an everlasting love, and underneath are the everlasting arms." And I hope that that's something that people can take away from her life.
Lucy, it has been such a joy to talk with you. I know that there's a lot of interest in this book, and so I was just really appreciating the opportunity to speak to you further, and I could probably talk for much longer.
I enjoyed it, and thank you very much for having me.
Okay, you're welcome. Well, we will get this recording to subscribers. For those of you who have joined us live, thank you so much. For those of you who are catching this later, thanks for tuning in. And Lucy, again, thank you so much for your time.
Thank you.
Okay. Okay, stop recording. There we